Okay, well, welcome everyone. I'm Sean Kelly. I'm a professor in the Philosophy, Cosmology, and Consciousness program, and I'm also the chair of Indigo Moonstar's dissertation. And I'm like to welcome you all here to Indigo's dissertation defense. Indigo is a doctoral candidate in the East-West Psychology program here at CIS. East-West Psychology is, or PCC, as we call the Philosophy, Cosmology, and Consciousness program, is a kind of kissing cousin of EWP. Now, let me say a few words about what we're doing. We're actually doing something that has been done for about 800 years, which is the, at least potential, we hope that it will be in fact the case, conferral of a blessing for a doctoral degree. This process began in University of Paris, Cambridge a little later, about 800 years ago. And at the time, and still now, the doctoral degree is a terminal degree. You can't go any further in terms of formal education. And it signals that you have reached the terminus of your time as a student, and you are about to cross, at least this is the expectation, cross a threshold when you will be entering into the community of scholars and teachers. Now, in the Middle Ages, there were two advanced degrees, the Master of Arts. There were only three main disciplines, divinity, law, and medicine, sometimes music, which you could pursue after you had been granted your master's. To be a master or magister meant that you had mastered a body of knowledge and intellectual skills, but to be a doctor, doctore, meant that you had not only mastered this body of knowledge, but you were prepared to become a teacher. Docta, Latin, means learned. It also means, it's the same root as, let me see now. Well, it means that you would have become an authority in your field. And to be an authority means that you have authored a significant text. And the significant text in question is a dissertation, which demonstrates your mastery of the body of knowledge that you have chosen to study. But it also means that you have succeeded in defending your claims, your main position, your thesis, in the presence of a group of selected doctors who will be able to vouch that you are in fact ready to cross this threshold. So it's not just a formal, certification process. It's actually something deeper. In psychological terms, depth psychological terms, we could say that it's an archetypal process that is participating in the archetype of initiation, right? So initiation is really one of the most important, oldest processes of transformation that human beings have been undergoing for many, many millennia. And it signals the death of one identity and the birth of a new identity, as well as the entering into the new community that corresponds to that identity. Now, how do we know that the candidate has successfully completed the document? Well, we have to acknowledge that the document constitutes either the creation or interpretation of new knowledge and original research, the identification or consolidation of a substantial body of knowledge and research at the forefront of the field. But there also has to be a demonstration of the ability to conceptualize, design, and implement a project for the generation of new knowledge. So that's what we're looking at today. Now, let me see, let me introduce the committee. So the committee is, I've already introduced myself, I'm the chair. And we are also joined today by Dr. Craig Schindler, who is also a professor in the Department of East-West Psychology here at the California Institute of Integral Studies. He is the author of Myths Among Us, When Timeless Tales Return to Life, also of Terra Psychological Inquiry, Restoring Our Relationship with Nature, Place, and Planet. And he's also the co-editor of Ecotopia, Healing with Nature in Mind. Dr. Chalquist writes and teaches at the intersection of psyche, story, and imagination, with one foot in the academy and the other in, I won't say the real world, but the other world. As a lorologist, he provides resources for exploring the limits and possibilities of the personal and collective stories we navigate by in order to deepen, expand, or replace them. So we move from being confined by them to authoring them. So really completely appropriate. Actually, couldn't imagine a better committee member for this particular dissertation. And we are very honored as well to have Dr. Craig Schindler as our external examiner. I've been wanting to meet Dr. Schindler for a long time. Dr. Schindler is a nationally known author and speaker, coach and counselor in transformative psychology, conflict resolution expert. He's an executive coach as well, and former professor of environmental ethics. Dr. Schindler is president of Project Victory and has facilitated national dialogues on peace and security, nuclear weapons, the environment, health and well-being, interfaith understanding, and race. He's also pioneered methods of conflict resolution and mediated dialogue and trained over 30,000 people in personal leadership, communication, and conflict resolution skills. He's the author of the forthcoming book, Choose Hope, You Matter. He's also the co-author of The Great Turning with Dr. Gary Lapide. So I'm so delighted to have you both on this committee, and I thank you enormously. This is how we're going to proceed now. Indigo is going to share the fruits of his research. I imagine, I don't know, Indigo, how long you had planned, but usually we expect around a 40-45 minute presentation. But after this presentation, the committee will engage Indigo in dialogue, and this is the defense proper, where we will ask probing questions that will give Indigo the opportunity to reveal his competence, his mastery, his learnedness in the chosen field, after which the committee will retire to deliberate on Indigo's performance. And we will come to a decision. Now, this decision regards both the dissertation and the defense. At this point, the committee has already certified more or less the dissertation. We've all read the document, given feedback. So it's unlikely that any issues would arise during the defense, but it's not impossible. Sometimes things arise in the context of the defense, which indicate issues to be addressed. So we will retire and come to our conclusion, and there are three main possibilities. One is that the defense has revealed that the dissertation is no longer viable. Of course, this would be catastrophic. It's highly unlikely, but it is a theoretical possibility, and that's why this is a true initiation. The second possibility is that there are only minor issues that have been identified in the dissertation or in the actual defense, but the defense was a success, and there we go. The third possibility is that there are actually no revisions, certainly no substantial revisions. The defense was a total success, and of course that is the outcome that we always hope for. Okay, with that, I'm going to turn it over to you, Indigo.
All right, thank you so much, Sean, for that amazing introduction and vote of encouragement, and of course the introductions for the committee as well. You've been such a great friend and guide and mentor to me for the last 15 years, and such a huge inspiration for this entire project. So thank you for being my chair and for hanging in there with me in the long haul.
It's been a delight, Indigo, and I'll say more about you later when it's my turn. Thank you.
Thanks. Dr. Chalquist, thank you one more time for jumping in here at the 11th hour. Dr. Phelps really helped me get this dissertation into its approvable form initially, but you were always a huge inspiration in there as well. And so I'm glad that it finally worked out timing-wise. And Dr. Schindler, of course, we've known each other as well for over 20 years. And I would say this dissertation really started in Ralph's class, where I met you, Dr. Ralph Quinn, Professor Emeritus of Psychology and Religion at the University of California, Santa Cruz. He was the first person that I ever heard mention CIIS. So a huge thank you to him out there in the ethers. And also thank you to everyone else who's here, my birth bomb, Nancy O'Connell, Benita, Larry, anyone else that I can't see, or anyone else listening later. And may the 4th be with you all. Happy Star Wars Day. Also want to thank all my friends and colleagues for their support. And of course, my beloved partner, Dr. Megan Rose Wooliver, whose idea it was for me to defend on this particular May the 4th be with you day. So without further preamble, I'm going to dive in. I have a lot to cover. It's a very ambitious project, as you know. Thank you for reading the whole thing. I definitely feel like I wrote 2 dissertations. So again, thank you for reading it all. This is my dissertation, Visions of the Great Turning, Utopianism and Conscious Evolution in New Age Science Fiction. And this is an image by artist Mark Henson that's been inspirational to me through this project, with images of war and destruction on the left. And in the center, we have a new pioneer who appears to be looking at pictographs of the time that we're living in now. And on the right, we have this ecotopian civilization. We see a group of people seated in a circle on a grassy knoll. And in one of those futuristic looking buildings in the background, when you see this painting up close, there's actually a museum to internal combustion vehicles. Some definitions just to frame everything here. This dissertation is definitely building on the idea of the Great Turning that was originally coined by my dear friends, Doctors Schindler and Lapid back in 1989. And then significantly carried forward and developed by numerous other thinkers, including, of course, Joanna Macy and David Korten, who did a lot of economic work with it. And then the concept of utopianism, I feel, is rooted in myths of the golden age that go back for eons. We have stories of Atlantis from Plato and Plato's other musings on a perfected state, as it were. And teachings about the golden age. We have the New Jerusalem and the New Earth, the heaven on earth that's spoken of in the Christian Bible. And then, of course, St. Thomas More, who wrote the book Utopia, with this deliberate entendre from the Greek ou, meaning good, and EU meaning good and ou meaning no, this juxtaposition of the good place versus the no place or the nowhere, the unachievable utopia. And I've brought this into conversation with the field of conscious evolution, which is most closely identified with Barbara Marx Hubbard, but there are numerous other thinkers and contributors to it, and she does a great job of bringing them all in to synthesis and conversation in her works. We have Irvin Laszlo, Ken Wilber, really too many to mention, but we find a number of the roots of the conscious evolution field to be in integral yoga. On that note, Sri Aurobindo's book, The Ideal of Human Unity, ended up becoming my primary lens for this dissertation, because he muses at length on the nature of the world state and discusses other themes that I found in the novels that I studied, such as the religion of humanity. And building on the work of our friend, Dr. Stephen Julich, as well as Peter Hees and an independent researcher named Alan Kaslev, I really found some interesting correlations with Mira Alfasa's early Kabbalistic training and how that influenced and was integrated into integral yoga and became foundational to it, particularly to Aurobindo's cosmogony, his conception of the creation of the universe. I've brought Haridas Chaudhuri in as much as I could. I really feel like I could have done more with him in this dissertation, but it was such an ambitious project, and I was getting so much out of both the mother and the ideal of human unity. But he's definitely in here and has a few good mentions. As far as the New Age goes, I was directed to the work of Wouter Hanegraaff by Dr. Kelly. He did a very comprehensive survey of the New Age as an emerging Western religious tradition. There's also the work of J. Gordon Melton, and of course, the Theosophical Society, which is foundational to the New Age, as Hanegraaff demonstrates. And then science fiction has this whole through line that's now about 200 years old. We can really, trace it back to Mary Shelley's Frankenstein as the first widely recognizable and still relevant work of science fiction, Gothic horror / science fiction. Thank you so much, Dr. Chalquist, for reminding me to include the works of Edward Bulwer-Lytton, a prolific science fiction author throughout the mid to late 19th century. And it was really him and a couple of others who got science fiction going in the early 1870s in the English-speaking world, while Jules Verne was still catching on. He had become a big deal by about 1875, but his path was paved by Bulwer-Lytton and a few others. Then we have, by the end of the 19th century, Edward Bellamy, who was one of the first people to begin using science fiction as a vehicle for expressing utopian socialist ideas. And this tradition was then followed and responded to by dozens of other thinkers on into the early 20th century, including most notably one H.G. Wells. Aurobindo speaks about the Golden Age. Early on in the ideal of human unity, he describes it as a tradition in which man was freely social without society, not bound by laws or institutions, but living by natural instinct or free knowledge. He held the right law of his living within himself and needed neither to prey on his fellows nor to be restrained by the iron yoke of the collectivity. And Aurobindo waxes further about these ideas and then goes on to say that our progress may end up being a devious round leading from the easy and spontaneous uniformity and harmony which reflects nature to the self-possessed unity which reflects the divine. So some further background and situating for this dissertation. I built it on a series of 4 pillars or assertions, beginning with this idea of the age of Aquarius and what Hanegraaff calls the New Age sensu lato, or beginning basically in the early 70s when the New Age emerged from its theosophical roots and began becoming sort of a distinct, although very diverse, Western religious tradition. And I find this to be juxtaposed with the end of the Vietnam War and all of the pain and suffering and ideological polarization that caused, that has continued and worsened. And I would dare say that these last 2 years of the pandemic have turned it up to 11. My second assertion is about the connection between neoliberalism and runaway climate change. My sources primarily for this are Oreskes and Conway from their book 2014 about the collapse of Western civilization, as well as an article by Richard Smith that Sean Kelly posted in 2013 called 6 Theses on Saving the Humans, Capitalism and the Destruction of Life on Earth. And both of them are just basically making the point that neoliberalism's marriage to capitalism as the only possible organization of a free society, as well as its emphasis on corporate profits over people and the health of the planet, has basically paralyzed its response to climate change. And then the metaphor, the ideas of like a runaway train speeding towards a cliff with no brakes. My third assertion or pillar relates to the inflation that we've been also seeing turned up to 11 or 12 or 13 just this past year. But the widening of the wealth gap has been happening for about 50 years now. And a lot of economists really peg the beginning of the death of the middle class in 1974, which is when the wage stagnation really started. And so this time of the early to mid 70s is a common theme in this work and in the novels that I've studied, some of them anyway. Also, Gillens and Page, researchers that were associated with Northwestern University and Princeton University, respectively, published a study in 2015 claiming to demonstrate through a series of thought experiments that America is no longer a functioning democracy, that it's basically become a corporate oligarchy based on whose political contributions influence the policies that actually end up benefiting them directly. And finally, my fourth assertion and the trajectory of this dissertation is that a new paradigm is already emerging. Dr. Schindler called it the Great Turning. Ray and Anderson in 2001 called it the cultural creatives, which I see more of a person descriptor. It's kind of a clunky term for a worldview. And I also found a great article by a woman named Sally Garner in 2007 called Today's Copernican Flip, where she talks about the idea of a global integral civilization and compares this conscious evolution basically to the Copernican revolution. And so I'm building on Dr. Kelly's assertion that we're basically living through a century of transition between worldviews that's analogous to the 16th century and the dawn of the modern era. And I like to point out that St. Thomas More published Utopia a year before Martin Luther nailed his 99 Theses to the Wittenberg chapel door. So I see utopia as being intimately connected with modernity at its roots. So my research objectives are to contribute to the articulation of this emerging worldview, and also to offer a new definition of utopia that is not a perfect society, but a functional egalitarian civilization based on sustainability and conscious evolution, and which I've pulled together what I consider to be a series of examples of. My thesis statement is that these utopian visions of New Age science fiction will be amplified, systematized, and substantiated when they're viewed through the lens of Sri Aurobindo's integral yoga, as well as the mother's important feminist and metaphysical contributions. I made a little update there. My primary research question is, what are the principles, practices, and structures elucidated in the selected utopian literature that offer possible solutions for the crisis of modern civilization? A brief note on what I consider to be the significance of this work. In academic terms, this is my transdisciplinary inquiry into the new paradigm and the new age, which is actually a relatively narrow body of really like hard scholarly research, including Hanegraaff and Melton and some others. My personal significance is the Bodies on the Gears speech by Mario Savio that I quoted in full in this section of the dissertation. This is the picture of him standing on the squad car in front of Sproul Hall at UC Berkeley. And it was his son, Daniel, that recommended that I read Ecotopia during our freshman year at Santa Cruz. So I owe a great debt to Daniel Savio as well, even though we actually disagree on just about everything. The social significance, I'll just say that, you know, humanity has been at a dire tipping point for a long time. I don't think I need to convince anybody on this committee of that. And the spiritual significance, I feel that there's still a great deal of value to be gained from Sri Aurobindo's work and the divinization of matter, his idea of the yoga of descent and ascent, which is another way of looking at involution and evolution, the idea that we're not just trying to reach higher states of consciousness, that we're also drawing down those supramental energies into the earthly plane and literally divinizing the earth. He also speaks about the religion of humanity and the ideal of human unity, and we're going to return to that concept very shortly. So a brief note on my methodology, which ended up being about 80% alchemical hermeneutics, which has been developed by Robert Romanishin starting in 2007 and a number of his students and co-researchers. Me and a number of my colleagues were introduced to this work by Dr. Chalquist in his qualitative methodologies class. And it's all about making research sacred and transformative. He does this wordplay about researching and returning and remembering or reconstituting. And, you know, I honestly found this book to be quite repetitive at times, but I also got a lot out of it in terms of his prompting to read between the lines and seeking that which has been lost in these works. So another thing that he offers is reinterpreting the hermeneutic circle as a spiral, because as we travel this round from generality to specificity and back again, we're not coming back to the same point. If we conceive of it as a three-dimensional spiral, each time we go around, we're reaching another higher level. And in terms of what am I researching in myself, I would say that it's my own savior complex and utopian desires, which are things that I've been sitting with for most of my life. Just a brief continuation on the methodology. I included about 20% of the organic inquiry developed by Dia Curry and Stephen Wells and a number of others. It had originally been conceived as a 50-50 type of thing. I was going to do a whole qualitative ethnography on a half dozen eco-villages, and I had bit off more than I could chew. So this is an area for further research. And I also, I've written a short piece kind of comparing the 6 Orphic moments to the 6 phases of organic inquiry. I'll share it with you, Craig. I think you'll actually like it. I see qualitative inquiry as the qualitative other side to what alchemical hermeneutics is doing, because it's also about self-inquiry and making yourself part of the research and restoring the I in research, as well as making research sacred. Just a quick note that I did some preliminary research visiting these eco-villages in 2012 with my friends and partners, Zeg in Germany, Domenher in Italy, Findhorn in Scotland, all different incubators of alternative civilization that I'm intending to study further. And so these 3 categories really self-selected and emerged organically just after the dissertation proposal was approved. And it was this very much like this aha facepalm moment of course, it's always been this. These have always been my foundations, with the third one being what I really wanted to contribute with this dissertation. But it started with Ecotopia and this idea of ecological civilization. It continued with the eco-feminine while I was reading Starhawk as I was being introduced into eco-psychology and eco-spirituality about midway through my undergrad. And continuing with this idea of conscious evolution that I really began learning about at CIIS. And in this dissertation, this attempt to redefine utopia, partially through Aurobindo's The Ideal of Human Unity. So in this first section, these ecotopian visions of utopia, these are the 3 novels that I selected, beginning with the novel Ecotopia, which etymologically translates to the home place. And I find this to be Ernest Kallenbach's early attempt at eco-socialism. I actually determined that he got a lot of his best ideas from this novel from Murray Bookchin, who had published them about 10 years earlier. But despite the fact that Kallenbach was a somewhat, I wouldn't say traditionalist, but he was a cisgendered white male, he really did his best to include ecofeminism in a positive light, which included eco-spirituality that he saw as foundational to this integral or ecological civilization. And also, I would say, an early attempt at eco-psychology, even though that term didn't really come into use until about 10 years later. And he didn't use the term ecological civilization either, but he called them stable state systems. So this was his call to action for bioregionalism, decentralization, some form of environmental green party, which was still very much in its infancy at this time, and secession of California and the West Coast, if necessary. And he gets very self-referential in his prequel novel that he published later, Ecotopia Emerging. He really reveals that I think he hoped that the first novel, Ecotopia, would have inspired something like that to happen, or at the very least, inspire the environmentalists and the labor movement to start working together more closely, which is one of his big themes. But I think he, ironically, he kind of figured, oh, well, my first call to action didn't work, so maybe I should just throw a bunch of facts and figures at them. Maybe that always helps, right? That's basically what Ecotopia emerging is. It's a whole lot of dense exposition and highly technical ideas, all of which are really, really good. And I did these, somewhat excruciating synopsis of these novels. So thank you one more time, Sean, for reading it all. But in this novel, he also includes some backstories about some of the characters from Ecotopia, and he includes a new character where he presents this idea of conscious evolution and conscious parenting leading to a breakthrough in clean energy, because this young lady is able to discover something that's a relatively simple biochemical process. And his idea is that the corporations had been making it too complicated by trying to find things that they could patent and make money off of. And so I threw in Stanley Robinson because he's one of the most prolific science fiction authors of our modern time. And I didn't realize that he had written his own response to Ecotopia. And he loves to write trilogies of books, and Pacific Edge is the third book in his first trilogy right after he graduated with his PhD in English Lit. He takes a more moderate approach, more of a business as usual, but he also imagines these sweeping eco-socialist reforms happening throughout the 2020s. And he describes it as the dismantling of neo-colonialism, and talks a lot about transforming existing architecture like strip malls and intersections and apartment complexes into more communal forms to fit this new eco paradigm. And it's interesting to note that the other two novels in that first Three Californias triptych, as he called it, are both very dystopian. So trying to bring Sri Aurobindo into conversation with Ecotopia was a little challenging at first, because as we know, Aurobindo's thought really predates the modern environmental movement as we know it. The ecological crisis, it just hadn't reached that tipping point yet before he passed on to the next phase of existence in 1950. But he is deeply reverent of nature. He always speaks about nature with a capital N, and always in the feminine tense. She is the embodiment of the divine feminine for him. But in the ideal of human unity, he waxes at length on his ideas about nation state formation and humanity's tendency to form ever larger tribal aggregates and cultural groupings. And a lot of this comes out of his English education, but he's also, he's applying his very particular Indian lens to it. He speaks at length about the tension between the individual and the state, and he really feels that centralization tends to lead towards authoritarianism. He feels that the state and the individual should have a reciprocal pursuit of perfection, and Kallenbach echoes this. He asserts that the state should exist for the benefit of the individual and the environment, and not the other way around, and that this goal is best served by maintaining the harmony of individuals and their communities in the seamless web of beings. So Sri Aurobindo definitely waxes utopian in ideal of human unity. He says the perfection of human life must involve the elaboration of this as yet unaccomplished harmony between those two poles of our existence, the individual and the social aggregate, and that the perfect society will be that which most entirely favors the perfection of the individual, but that the perfection of the individual will be incomplete if it does not help towards the perfect state of the social aggregate to which he belongs, and eventually to that of the largest possible human aggregate, the whole of a united humanity. And he goes on to say his belief that the perfection of the individual in a perfected society, or eventually in a perfected humanity, is the inevitable aim of nature. So as I dug a little deeper into this, I find the varieties of integral ecology, which was edited by Dr. Kelly and a few other colleagues. CIS has been making some great contributions to this field. I really got kind of hung up on Laudato Si in this area, and I'm going to go back and do some reworking of that and really work that anthology into the dissertation itself. But this whole project is deeply inspired by Dr. Schindler's World Peace Day vision that he had as he was preparing to give a presentation on the Great Turning. This idea of a commemoration of that human unity, of that coming together. And we find a number of other attempts and contributions that I see in this same spirit. We have the Earth Charter, we have the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, we have this whole movement towards ecological civilization, which I also discovered after this dissertation proposal was accepted, rooted in Whitehead and John Cobb and his son, Andrew Schwartz. A number of other people are contributing to this, and I find it very encouraging. And then, of course, I wanted to say something about Dr. Chalquist's Declaration of Enchantment. You make some beautiful points about the importance of imagination that I feel like really upholds this dissertation. In Article 11, you wrote, "Without the gifts of the imagination, we cannot fashion the new stories we need for carrying us forward. The systemic catastrophes all represent failures of the imagination, and therefore failures of the stories we tell ourselves about who we are, our place in the world, and how we should be with each other." And you went on to say that imagination is just another word for possibility brought into creative view. To explore possibility requires liberty. An unfettered imagination is the last outpost of freedom. Love that. So, moving on, my transference dialogues for this section, I forgot to mention that this is how the transference dialogues were grouped by the section rather than the text, and that this is an active imagination process of inviting in other voices and perspectives from these four different levels. That's a core part of the alchemical hermeneutic methodology. And I had a little way in each of these sections. So in this case, it was that I had once imagined myself as an ecotopian statesman when I was first working with this book back in college. But what emerged were these really cool themes of family and immigration, as well as some ideological polarization that played out in an interesting way in my family. And then other historical figures that might have been expected came up, like John Muir, the renowned environmentalist who loved California, as well as the Bear Flag Republic revolutionaries who originally declared independence from Alta California, only to be absorbed as an American colony about a month later in the mid-1840s. And then there were these powerful eco-cosmological statements that emerged from the goddess Califia, the namesake of California, and the green man or the horned god. And I found a couple really cool images here of both of them. So my conclusion for this chapter, I wrote that Ecotopia can be the only true utopia because it strives for balance rather than perfection. And Ecotopia seeks ecological harmony and sustainability, and therefore possesses longevity on an entirely new scale. It holds one of the primary functions of its society to be the health and well-being of the most basic unit of that society, the individual, and therefore fosters cooperation undreamt of in a purely capitalist world and unmatched by any of the socialist experiments of the 20th century. So, this work that started in my undergraduate really emerged organically, evolved organically in the eco-feminine direction as I was suggested to read The Fifth Sacred Thing by local neo-pagan author and activist Starhawk. And the image on the right is the millennial Gaia by another neo-pagan priest that we've had the opportunity to meet and do some practice with, named Oberon Zell. And before we dive into these, I actually wanted to open this section with Starhawk's declaration of the four sacred things, because I feel like this really follows in that same spirit as those others we just talked about, as well as the US Declaration of Independence that inspired them as well. So I'm just going to run through it really quickly, because this is her declaration of this ecotopian culture that she imagined emerging in San Francisco here, based on the belief that the earth is a living conscious being, and that in company with cultures of many different times and places, we name these things as sacred: air, fire, water, and earth. Whether we see them as the breath, energy, blood, and body of the mother, or as the blessed gifts of a creator, or as symbols of an interconnected systems that sustain life, we know that nothing can live without them. To call these things sacred is to say that they have a value beyond their usefulness for human ends, that they themselves become the standard by which our acts, our economics, our laws, and our purposes must be judged. No one has the right to appropriate them or profit from them at the expense of others. Any government that fails to protect them forfeits its legitimacy. All people, all living things are part of the earth life and so are sacred. No one of us stands higher or lower than any other. Only justice can assure balance. Only ecological balance can sustain freedom. Only in freedom can that fifth sacred thing that we call spirit flourish in its full diversity. To honor the sacred is to create conditions in which nourishment, sustenance, habitat, knowledge, freedom, and beauty can thrive. To honor the sacred is to make love possible. To this, we dedicate our curiosity, our will, our courage, our silences, and our voices. To this, we dedicate our lives, and I dedicate this dissertation. So in these eco-feminist visions of utopia, I've come to the idea that I think the fifth sacred thing was a West Coast neo-pagan response to A Handmaid's Tale, because it touches on a number of those same themes. It's basically the story of a post-collapse civil war between Northern and Southern California. It has themes of this communal eco-spiritual society that's built on subtle magic and urban agriculture and collectivism, but it's under the shadow of this looming fascist government to the south. But it's also a love story about triumph over shame and self-doubt, and Starhawk's homage to nonviolent resistance. Now, 20 years passed before she began work on the sequel, City of Refuge, and during that time, she was involved both with Occupy Wall Street and the Arab Spring. And it changed her views. She writes about this. It moved her a little bit more in the direction of direct action. And she said that the question that animated the sequel is, how do we build a new world when people are still so deeply damaged by the old? And I get choked up thinking about her response, her answer. The main character, Madrone, has a dream. Build a city of refuge in the heartland of the enemy, which in this case happens to be a dystopian Los Angeles of the near future. But it shows the power of telling a new story. Madrone and her lover Bird, who was incarcerated down there for 10 years, they go back to the Southlands, to a place that Starhawk indicates as the ruins of the Los Angeles eco-village that we visited. And one by one, they start gathering people and telling this new story, that their lives matter and that they all deserve to be happy, and that every city needs three things: a plaza to gather, a hearth, and a sacred tree. And so they build these things and they start creating this new community around this simple but beautiful story. And it shows hope in the face of adversity and certain defeat. And of course, the good guys win in the end, but there's always a cost, always a cost. And then in the same year, a local woman named Sarah Drew that we had the opportunity to meet, published a book called the Gaia Codex, which was her sort of eco-feminist response to the Da Vinci Code, I think, because that book included this ancient codex cylinder puzzle thing, if you remember. But she imagines this beautiful, unbroken matrilineal legacy of priestesses that's tens of thousands of years old. She calls them the priestesses of Astera. And there's also a little Harry Potter element here, because it's like this hidden magical world that's hidden just beyond our view. But her main character is this feminine Christ figure called Leela Sophia. She's the product of her parents' ritual sex magic combined with genetic engineering. And she has a blue morpho butterfly birthmark, and it's this recurring symbol of metamorphosis throughout the book. But she actually has the power of metamorphosis and shapeshifting, whereas she's going through adolescence and puberty, she shapeshifts daily into the bodies of different women from all of the Earth's cultures. And it's presented as this new ability that humanity is developing as a way to deepen our empathy. And she goes on this journey of discovery that leads her to a sacred union with the divine masculine, and they slip out of time and they emerge in this beautiful, they've crystallized this new paradigm, and they emerge hundreds of thousands of years in this future with this new species of humanity that has made all these myths about them. and remembers them. And they're like, oh, hey, you're back. We've been waiting for you. Welcome back. So my lens for this section ended up becoming the mother of the Sri Aurobindo ashram, Mira Alfasa, as well as Auroville itself. And this wasn't planned. I knew I wanted to talk about Auroville as an intentional community based on integral yoga. But, you know, I also ran into the challenge of, despite the fact that Sri Aurobindo was deeply feminist and deeply honored the divine feminine, he didn't really write about feminism per se. But when I tugged on this thread with Mira Alfasa, I found people calling her the mother of feminism in India. And I found these great eco-feminist readings on Auroville, which really helped me fill a gap of not being able to visit there in the course of this research. Serena Anderlini in 2006, writing for the journal Spaces of Utopia, she observed these postmodern contact zones there, and what she called border gnosis, or developing this concept of Mignolo's border gnosis. But she saw Auroville as this collection of Gaian laboratories for social experiments. And then later, a woman named Camilla Gierde did her master's thesis, and she called it her spiritual journey to the East, where she lived at Auroville and was embedded with one of the cooperative farms there called the Buddha Garden. And she describes these deep dialectic processes, not only between East and West and masculine and feminine, but also between capitalism and socialism, and this new age Western counterculture desire to experience and create alternative social structures, kind of butting up against this very traditionalist Indian culture that still is a big influence there. And this was great. One of her informants said this. She said that we are all servants of the divine, which means that in Auroville, all the citizens are doing a service and not work. This is based on the thought of not working for money, but for the community and for one's own self-growth. So as I dig a little deeper, I just want to mention Francois Duyabon, who coined the term ecofeminism in 1973 and wrote in 1978 that profit is the last phase of power and capitalism is the last stage of patriarchy. And it's kind of appropriate that this was in her novel, The Shepherdesses of the Apocalypse. And I also want to mention the 2019 gathering of the World Ecology Research Network, which was hosted at CIIS by the Anthropology and Social Change Department. And one of my favorite presentations there was by Marcy Smith, a professor from New York, whose title was Mater, a base materialist analysis of the maternal relation, with the subtitle Toward an Ecology of Hope. And she explores all of these labor dialectics about the state's need to control women and wombs, because labor comes from bodies which come from wombs. And so there's this never-ending need for this source of labor. And she's building on this idea that was, I believe, first expressed in a book called Caliban and the Witch by a woman named Silvia Federici. But she takes it in a very science fiction kind of dystopian direction, where she talks about ectogenesis and artificial womb technology. And we see all kinds of dystopian implications with that in Starhawk, of these, you know, genetically engineered test tube grown super soldiers they've known only violence for all of their life. And one of these finally breaks and turns, and this is a pivotal moment in this book. And there are numerous other, you know, eugenics and dystopian implications. The movie Gattaca created a visual that was based on Brave New World. And we also, you know, could go in the other direction. You know, if we can't grow more labor, why don't we just get the robots to do everything for us and hope that they don't become sentient and revolt and turn on us, as they did in The Matrix and in Battlestar Galactica and in other conceptions, you know, the sci-fi trope of the robocalypse, the robot apocalypse. So, you know, my assertion here is that these powers of subtle magic and powers of group consciousness, intuition, intention, and visualization, as described in Starhawk's narratives, stand in contrast to the increased technologization of the modern human and its associated experiences of isolation, alienation, disconnection, and the amplification of some of our worst tendencies like greed, aggression, and polarization. So I'll just say a bit on this. I did a little piece that I called a brief note on ascension. It's been up again, it was up in 2012, and it's been up again in 2020 at the solstice, with the idea that, I generally agree with, that 2012 just represented one portal that we passed through, and that we passed through another one on the solstice of 2020. But I feel like it's often dismissed as New Age jargon or spiritual bypassing. But I've uncovered some research that shows examples of a light body event or an evolution in 27 different world spiritual traditions. And there are other things going around right now about the idea of a micro supernova, which I think Proxima Centauri might have just done. And it's also been called this great solar flash, which would, bathe all of humanity in divine light and theoretically catalyze this evolutionary leap to a new stage of humanity, or at the very least give all of humanity a shared experience of divinity that is both immanent and transcendent. And Dr. Chalquist reminded me, as I've continued to include in this work, that ascension must be accompanied by descension. This is the involution and evolution, and we ignore the shadow and the underworld at our peril. So, the Transference Dialogues were a little bit more amorphous for this section. They included a lot of themes of questioning, hope and fear for the future. They happened, a year and a half into the pandemic. The disintegration and reintegration, feeling like everything's falling apart, the center cannot hold. Musing on the state of the world, but ultimately finding hope in this cosmic big picture or this big history view of the world. So my conclusions in this section are that what these stories add to this inquiry is precisely what they intended. They're a series of inspiring and cautionary tales that paint a grim but ultimately hopeful reality. In contrast to Kallenbach's nearly universal optimism, Starhawk's novels in particular present her conception of both the best and worst case scenarios for humanity's survival post an economic, environmental, and social collapse. Taken alongside Drew, both authors endeavor to inspire faith in humanity's hidden and forgotten subtle powers and in our innate ability to adapt and evolve to changing circumstances. The question they pose through their words and works is whether humanity will collectively answer the call to evolve and adapt. And the way I believe that we answer that call is through this field of conscious evolution that's been emerging in this framing, I would say, since the mid-'80s. But I find in this novel 2150 from the early to mid-'70s that it's quintessentially New Age. And it depicts a global utopian society in the mid-22nd century that's founded on conscious evolution, which is informed by an integrated perennial wisdom, honoring all of the spiritual traditions that we've already developed through the ages and cultures. And it's basically an old school time travel, Rip Van Winkle type story, where you wake up in the future, but with the New Age twist of the main character astral projecting back and forth between the time period of the title and when it was written in the early to mid-'70s. And it shows spiritual evolution at the center of this civilization, which is guided by what they call the macro philosophy. And this is a metaphor that the authors try to develop about macro versus micro humanity, which I see as a metaphor, representing the conflict between the new paradigm and the old. And so I only chose one other counterpart novel for this, but it's a juicy one because it was an award-winning book in 2004, and then it was adapted into a very ambitious film by the Wachowskis and a German director named Tom Tykwer in 2012. And I see this as a reincarnation, Cloud Atlas, I see it as a reincarnation passion play that shows the interweaving of karmic threads across hundreds of years and a half dozen incarnations. And it also has this feminine Christ figure who's actually a clone, a synthetic human called Somni 451. And she has this great quote about how from womb to tomb, we are all, our lives are not our own. From womb to tomb, we are bound to others. and through each crime and every act of kindness, we birth our future. And the film, I think, makes it even more apparent than the novel does, that when she is summarily executed for going against the grain, and daring to raise her own consciousness, she spawns not only a global revolution against the last standing nation, which is a dystopian corporate state, and spawns a whole new mythology and religion as well, which they explore in the final future time period, post-collapse. So this novel shows two different future dystopian time periods, but with pockets of an evolved society that I think in some ways resembles the macro family of 2150. So this is where the rubber really met the road with Ideal of Human Unity, because he's not only describing the religion of humanity, which the macro philosophy is kind of presented as, but this need for an underlying psychic unity, which they all have by developing these psychic powers and extrasensory powers. But there's also a really interesting inquiry in that 2150 novel, with all of its, rigidness in some ways, about the tension between the individual and the freedom, between our individual freedom and a state or cultural uniformity. And Aurobindo also goes on about all of the various challenges to forming a world state. He minces no words about the failures and inadequacies of the League of Nations and the United Nations, but he points out that both of those organizations arose out of massive global conflicts. So if another one were to occur, which he did see as kind of an inevitability, he believed that it would lead to a greater global integration towards a world state. But he still saw these two probable outcomes as being either a peaceful confederation or federation of free nations, or possibly even smaller city-states or tribal groupings, or else a rigid and centralized bureaucratic state that would tend towards authoritarian forms. Now, my way in, or my analysis, I have to bring in Barbara Marx Hubbard, who passed away a few years ago, because her name is most closely associated with conscious evolution. But as I've mentioned, she brings in all these other thinkers that have contributed to it. But very briefly, she talks about the 3 C's, the new crises, which I think we've explored at length, the new capacities, which I see not only as she described it, our ability to start becoming conscious of our own evolutionary process, but also potentially these new capacities could be the development of these other extrasensory powers that Aurobindo did write about, and that we see examples of in 2150. And then, of course, the new cosmology, which has been advanced by our friends Brian Swim and Thomas Berry and a number of others, the idea that the universe is a conscious living thing, and not only that, but that it's actually hardwired to evolve life as we know it, that's capable of this self-reflective thought. She has this beautiful wheel of co-creation that we've got a slide about next. And she also talks about this cosmic code that we're going to come back to, which is the way that the universe speaks through us that we can contact by exploring our creativity. So this blew me away. I had seen this wheel of co-creation before, but I had not seen this 2.0 version until I was pulling together this slideshow. And this was done by Mark Goffney, building on the work of Hubbard at the Foundation for Conscious Evolution. Real briefly, we have the dialectic spiral of the evolution of consciousness. We have the wheel was really Hubbard's, but the framings around the outside, I think, are Gaffney's contribution. And I just want to linger at the bottom of the circle, the memory of the future. This is one of the things I've been exploring through these novels. And really, the democratization of enlightenment through an evolutionary world spirituality. That's what Aurobindo was talking about. That's what the macro philosophy tried to show an example of. And if we can get there, it will lead us into a love story with the universe. It will lead us into this evolutionary relationship of evolutionary intimacy, and then on into this cosmocentric consciousness and this infinite potential where we have the sky's the limit, quite literally. Drilling down I found some very interesting correlations when I was originally pulling this research together. And they remain relevant, I believe. So Sean helped me to understand that the macro philosophy is really just the repackaged natural philosophy of Fichte and Schelling, but I'm arguing that it's built into this science fiction, new age mythology and ethos, which is presented as the foundation of a global integral civilization, a collaborative learning culture, very much like what Sally Gerner described and imagined. And of course, the New Age and this 2150 macro philosophy has a healthy dose of theosophy, Edgar Cayce, and New Thought, as well as Eastern spiritualities, but that appeared to be confined to 3 texts: a book on Lao Tzu, a book on the Sufis, and an East-West anthology on reincarnation that was published by the Theosophical Society, but doesn't appear to include Aurobindo. So I think that these correlations that I'm seeing have filtered down into the New Age through theosophy and some of its common influences and origins with integral yoga. So again, I found strong resonances with the ideal of human unity and Aurobindo's call for a religion of humanity, as well as this yoga of ascent and descent, this involution and evolution. And then when I pulled on this thread of integral yoga and Kabbalah, I uncovered our friend Dr. Julich's work, as well as Peter Hees and Alan Kaslev, writing about Mira Alfasa and her early training with the Philosophie Cosmique, this Hermetic Kabbalah newsletter in Algeria, and how that was integrated into the integral yoga. The icon of that newsletter, the lotus on a 6-pointed star, she literally borrowed that and gave it to Aurobindo, and it became the symbol of the ashram, as Dr. Julich showed. And Alan Kaslev goes through this whole exploration about integral yoga and the new physics and the origins of the universe and its ultimate destiny of the divinization of matter. And not only do I see correlations with the macro scale and its levels of consciousness and the Kabbalah and levels of consciousness, and then Aurobindo's levels of consciousness, but there's this whole thing that revealed itself about the moon model and the Platonic solids. So let me just back up a quick second and talk about the flower of life. This is an ancient symbol that's about 4,000 years old that was found engraved on the Temple of Osiris. And it's a way of thinking about, in this tradition, the involution of consciousness, the flaring forth, or the Big Bang, if you will. So the idea is that consciousness decides to become aware of itself, and that's represented by it drawing the first circle. And then it's, oh, that's cool. So it moves to the edge and does it again. It moves to the edge, does it again, does it again, does it again. So that's an image that represents how source consciousness fractalizes and fragments as it involutes into matter. And as it keeps going, creates denser and denser levels of matter. So not only do we find derived from this flower of life symbol, the tree of life pattern that we see here, also called the pattern on the trestle board, which is associated with Kabbalah, but we find that it also creates this 3-dimensional image called Metatron's cube. Now bear with me for a second. I know this is a lot. Metatron's cube results from connecting all the vertices of the flower of life. And it's basically a nested form of the 5 Platonic solids. And what Robert J. Moon proposed in 1986 is that all of the known elements on the periodic table correspond to one of these shapes. Now, people called him crazy. And it wasn't until about 2004 when the electron microscope technology became advanced enough to actually start demonstrating that this is true. So there's a great novel and a great article, Lawrence Heck and Charles Stevens, 2004, in the journal 21st Century Journal of Science and Technology. What this is saying to me is that the structure of our physical reality is intimately connected to that process of the involution of consciousness, involution and fragmentation of consciousness, as represented by that flower of life. And this, to me, upholds what Hubbard calls the cosmic. I think this is what Hubbard is calling the cosmic code. And I think it also relates to and upholds Swim Berry's telos, which is their word for the mathematical constant that describes the expansion of the universe, which appears to be perfectly tuned to evolve stars and planets and life as we know it, that eventually becomes capable of self-reflective thought, and then eventually of becoming conscious of and able to influence its own evolutionary process. That's what conscious evolution means. So bear with me. I'm going to wrap it up. We're getting close, but it's about to get weird. Because what I'm proposing here is the idea of this macro contact, which is the other foundation of the macro philosophy and their whole civilization. It is a non-dual samadhi experience that they're able to reproduce relatively consistently. And I'm arguing that that is the strange attractor of their new civilization. It's also what informs and helps them develop the other extrasensory powers. So real quick, and this comes from you, Dr. Chalquist. The idea of strange attractors is basically a mathematical concept that can be applied to systems theory and society as a way of understanding, you know, what are the things that make us tick? What are the shared agreements that our whole society coalesces around? Because it's non-local, it's non-linear, but there are, you know, society functions on a certain set of shared agreements, like wearing pants or some other kind of garment over your nether regions. Basically, a mathematician named Chris Lucas said that social systems are invariably complex. It's many people doing many things and having many values and interests. And that's why it's this sort of chaotically charted nonlinear equation. And Dr. Chalquist said that when complex planetary systems eventually wear out, their dissipative structures reach the brink of chaos where the system redesigns itself, which is autopoiesis, or else it falls apart. So strange attractors of meaning, this is another way of thinking about this, is basically what I'm saying, that meaning has fractal structure. This is what Dr. Chalquist said. The strange attractors of meanings, they guide and exhort human actions, and meanings which tend to preserve their stability become dogmas, and dogmas impede the emergence of new strange attractors of meaning. This is from another mathematician, Vladimir Dimitrov. So when I gave this presentation originally, I said that, you know, the strange attractors of modernity, we could probably say are money, power, and sex, just for the sake of argument. So here we are with Earthrise again from Dr. Chalquist, who wrote that a new mythos, an underlying meta story to furnish collective psychic structure for how to relate to this society to the world of nature and the cosmos, actually drawn from Joseph Campbell. What the macro contact is a fracto audiovisual experience of bliss and non-duality. And the character, as Alexander wrote, said, I seem to enter an infinite ocean of unspeakable unity, oneness, and balance, accompanied by the most soul-satisfying experience of harmony imaginable. And here we have Alex Gray's painting, The Theologue. And I've always found its subtitle to be very compelling, The Union of Human and Divine Consciousness, weaving the fabric of space and time in which the self and its surroundings are embedded. So you may be aware of Dr. Martin Ball. He published a great article on the compound 5-MeO-DMT, which instantly crosses the blood-brain barrier and creates a non-dual experience. And he described it as a feeling of total surrender to the direct presence of or union with God, readily comparable to Hindu experiences of moksha or Buddhist experiences of samadhi and nirvana. He went on to say that the user will generally experience a full entry into complete God consciousness, total ego dissolution, and energetic expansion into the totality of the universe. Users generally describe their experience as entering into a state of divine grace, being enfolded in the pure energy of love, becoming one with the mind of God, and experiencing the true nature of reality. Now, what this is a +4 experience. This is Alexander Shulgin's rating scale, and he described this as a rare and precious transcendental state, which has been called a peak experience or a religious experience, a divine transformation, a state of samadhi, and many other cultures. It's not connected to the +1, 2, or 3 of the measuring of a drug's intensity, which is how he developed this scale. It is a state of bliss, a participation mystique, a connectedness with both the interior and exterior universes, which has come about after the ingestion of a psychedelic drug, but which is not necessarily repeatable with the subsequent ingestion of that same drug. Now he says, if a drug or technique or process were ever to be discovered, which would consistently produce a +4 experience in all human beings, it is conceivable that it would signal the ultimate evolution and perhaps the end of the human experiment. Now, this, of course, led me down the rabbit hole of the end of history. I went down it a couple of times, and all I'll say there is that let's not be too hasty. But that this is very compelling because Martin Ball has shown that we actually have this technology and capability already. And so where does this lead? Sally Garner's idea of a global a global integral civilization that would be essentially that sort of development would be as momentous as the original Copernican revolution. She's building on complexity theory. Her idea is of a collaborative learning culture. She thinks of societies as a knowledge ecology and an information processing ecosystem. And she argues against inherent greed, which she sees stemming from cultural corruption, inequality, and oligarchic culture. She does recognize, as a good systems theorist would, that some hierarchy is necessary, for functions like the brain and the nervous system, but that oligarchy is elitist and classism. And oligarchic cultures invariably destroy themselves. She sees collective creativity and universal learning at the heart of a global integral civilization. And so these are the two kind of dual concepts that I see expressed really beautifully in the macro philosophy. But what really blew my mind was this article by Tristan Gulliford, where he wrote, building on the idea of human unity. His title was Sri Aurobindo's Radical Social Vision, the possibility of a telepathic utopia. Now, he admits that it's a thought experiment, but he builds on the idea of human unity because Aurobindo says that the religion of humanity would need to be the highest active ideal of mankind. It would need to spiritualize itself and become the inner law of human life. And he also brings in Aurobindo's other writings through Peter Hees about cities and yogic powers, which he doesn't talk about often. He doesn't mention at all an ideal of human unity, but Gulliford is asserting that by reading the two together, it deepens and substantiates the argument because that underlying psychic unity would support a deeper and truer form of self-governance. And, Gulliford says some other poignant things about America as an oligarchy that I found compelling. So again, this is Gulliford's title that I borrowed and am developing. Aurobindo wrote that the saving power would be a new psychological factor that would at once make a united life necessary to humanity and force it to respect the principle of freedom. This religion of humanity seems to be the one growing force which tends in that direction, for it makes for the sense of human oneness. It has the idea of the race, and yet at the same time, it respects the human individual and the natural human grouping. But its present intellectual form seems hardly sufficient. The idea, powerful in itself and in its effects, is not yet powerful enough to mold the whole life of the race in its image, for it has to concede too much to the egoistic side of human nature, once all and still 9/10 of our being, with which its larger idea is in conflict. Now,
just a little time. Sorry, just a little time check there, Indigo. Or do you have a sense of how much more you need for your presentation? Because we're at 20 after 12 now.
Yep, this is it. Wrapping up right here.
Okay.
Aurobindo believed that these civic powers were available to anyone, that they're latent in all of humanity, and that they could be developed by everyone if given the proper training. And Gulliford waxes about building a civilization around that, which is what the macro philosophy tried to show. So I took what Shulgin said and I reinterpreted it a little bit, and I wrote that if a sacred medicine or technique were developed that could consistently trigger a non-local experience, a non-dual experience in all humans, it could be perhaps become the new mythic experience or rite of passage, like the Eleusinian mysteries for the emerging integral worldview. Now, the transference dialogues in this one were, again, like being in the chrysalis, turning into the goo, waiting to emerge from the cocoon. Megan was sick in the other room, so she was within the field, but she helped me see that that meant that I had to do this last process in community and partnership. And I feel like I could maybe do one more transference dialogue for the whole dissertation if you guys think it's necessary. But I had some, themes of the divine feminine emerged as Marilyn Monroe, who Megan had made a pilgrimage to her grave in Hollywood. But I also felt like this silent affirmation, and I was sensitive to egoic bleed through, not wanting to imagine the universe telling me like, oh, you're doing such a great job. You really figured it out, man. I did have kind of a cool experience trying to project myself into the future and into a future incarnation that would be able to see me because he had been trained that way from birth. And that was kind of cool. Some interesting things showed up, but I also felt like, as Master Yoda said, always in motion is the future. It's difficult to see. And, it expressed a fair amount of exhaustion and just wanting this to all be done and to birth this baby. But I also felt this grounded feel of presence and this peaceful surrender, which I related to the last time that I personally journeyed with the 5-MeO DMT, where I surrendered. I said that, yes, okay, I'm ready, over and over again. So my conclusions for this chapter are basically building on the idea that the ability to become conscious of our own evolution is the birthright of every living thing, and it might be the strange attractor that draws life forward into higher states of complexity. The correlations I found between integral yoga and the Kabbalistic cosmogony, the new physics, and the sacred geometry of the flower of life, which connects to the moon model of molecular structures, can demonstrate certain metaphysical concepts, such as the interconnected nature of creation. I do feel that this is Hubbard's cosmic code and Swim Barry's Talos, or an expression of it. And I think Alan Kaslev also intended it to be the beginnings of a bridge between science and spirituality, and I think it can be. So my dissertation conclusions, let me get my full page up here. I'm there. The amplification through the narrative fiction contributes to the growing collective mythology of hope and fear, which is embodied in utopian and dystopian literature. I'm contributing to the idea of science fiction as a modern mythology that was developed by Alexei and Corey Panchin. And I think I've deepened those stories in conversation with Sri Aurobindo. I see the New Age as an attempt to articulate this new integral paradigm, and that New Age, especially the New Age sensu lato, represent a particular moment in time of the 1970s, but I feel like it will continue to evolve and adapt to these changing times. I think the New Age identity may have waned a little bit, but I still see a lot of that content. I think the Great Turning remains culturally relevant, and I see a lot of stuff about the Great Awakening online these days. And what is this, the second, third, fourth Great Awakening? I think it depends on who you ask. But this particular movement is tied in with a lot of fringe theories, some of which showed up in Starhawk's novels. So that's all I'll say there. I nevertheless feel that these are compatible concepts that deserve further synthesis and development, which is what I've attempted. Sri Aurobindo expressed the need to develop the divine masculine and divine feminine in balance, and this will continue to be an essential part of conscious evolution. I want to point out that the Damanhurians recognize a third pole called the Divine Androgen, which is the centerpiece of their first mural in their Temple of Humanity. And that's the first of their 7 interlocking underground temples that is really dedicated to their own version of this integral consciousness and this religion of humanity. And then finally, I want to say that conscious evolution is the birthright and the destiny of all sentient beings, really all living beings. And it is the destination of all life. We are alive at an important cusp in the evolution of consciousness on this planet, as a number of people, including our esteemed company, have said. And, I do have one lingering concern that has emerged over the last 2 years about democratic socialism and eco-socialism, however necessary and well-intentioned they may be. If I'm the Communist Party of China, I would see that as a potential backdoor to maybe introduce their more extreme form of communism into the West. And Aurobindo was very clear that this isn't compatible with our very individualized consciousness, and that cultures in the East have maintained more of their collective consciousness, which makes it work a little bit better there. I also think that wealthy elite would be agreeable to this so long as it preserved their relative, class and status power in what would become a two-class system. So that's just, a little tangent there, because really what I've attempted here has not only been a synthesis between East-West psychology and the philosophy, cosmology, and consciousness perspectives, but also between divine masculine and feminine. And what I believe I can offer is perhaps the beginnings of a synthesis between left and right. I know that sounds ambitious and crazy, but I also feel like I might just be, thanks to my father who's sitting right here, maybe particularly uniquely suited to attempt that. So I'm going to close with this process from Kim Stanley Robinson, this quote. I would say if this was the one drip that was distilled from this whole dissertation, this would be it. The idea that utopia is the process of making a better world, the name for one path history can take, a dynamic, tumultuous, agonizing process with no end. But I'm going to argue that it need not be struggle forever, because the end of history implies an end to that struggle of making a better world. But I think we shouldn't be in too much of a rush to declare it. And that's it. Briefly, my areas for future research are going to be working with Craig on republishing The Great Turning. I want to do more work with the Dominiher Federation, the Findhorn Foundation, and I would love to visit Auroville at some point. I uncovered a interesting field on future life hypnotic progression and trying to visualize these future incarnations. And I think I'd be remiss if I didn't say I was going to try and explore cities and powers some more. And then there's this idea of, maybe the Star Trek future that I think I share a love for with my committee is another strange attractor that might be drawing us forward into a more positive future. That's it. Thank you.
Wow.
Sorry, I know that was a lot. Thank you for bearing with me.
Well, if you think that's a lot, you should read the dissertation.
Yeah, I know. Yeah. Which I will be.
It's actually an impressive summary. Truly, Indigo. I don't know if I've ever come across a document or a heart mind that is so capacious and generous and curious and creative in making connections. It's not only the document, but you are a truly impressive being that way, and it's been a delight working with you. It was always a pleasure getting updates. So the document is long, as you know. It's over 500 pages, which
sorry about that.
That's so funny. Sorry about that. It's usually not allowed, but in your case, you're you have a winning way about you, and your exuberance and the creativity. Anyway.
Well, let me just say to that real quick, please, that in retrospect, I actually feel like I could have gotten it done in about 250 to 300 pages just on the conscious evolution section.
Sure.
With everything that I uncovered about ideal of human unity and the Kabbalah, all that whole connection. But I needed to go back to my roots in order to get there. That's all I can say.
I know. So, well, there's so many directions we could go here. That
was my plan, to just give you too much. So
it's a great strategy. But maybe I can focus a little bit on. Well, first of all, I'm so happy that you've given your attention to this powerful symbol concept of the Great Turning, which, as you know, I've been deeply engaged with and inspired by, and my thanks again to you, Craig, for introducing this term, which has been so generative. Yeah. So coupling that with the long-standing word or concept of utopia, I think it makes perfect sense. And it's impressive how in your treatment of this complex of utopia, great turning, you strive to bring into creative tension these two poles, which we might describe as the political economy, let's say, for one pole, and the psycho-spiritual dimension in the other. So in your conclusions, you stress the psycho-spiritual pole, and particularly these certain kinds of maybe transpersonal experiences, as you call it, the strange attractor for conscious evolution, which is not only evolution of consciousness, but presumably an evolution toward whatever our planetary, whatever the Earth community might be striving for. Okay, so I'd like you to say a bit more about do you see the possibility of pursuing utopia in the direction of an ecological civilization, put it this way, without any commitment to or conscious engagement with the psycho-spiritual pole? Because obviously Kallenbach, for instance, and many people who are working from a purely secular worldview would claim that what we just need to do is work at the level of the political economy. And if we don't do that, no amount of psycho-spiritual development is going to save the day or even avoid the worst in terms of the accelerating planetary crisis, ecological devastation, and civilizational collapse. So how important do you feel it is to stress the psycho-spiritual dimension? Or is that something you would be willing, if you were a kind of diplomat on the world stage trying to promote a transition, promote the great turning and a transition to an ecological civilization, how important would it be for you to foreground, stress, or even include this psycho-spiritual dimension in dialogue with people from the People's Republic of China, for instance, for whom that might be unintelligible or not as welcome? That's my first question.
Okay, well, that's a very good question. I would say that we need both, obviously, but I wouldn't be willing to sacrifice the eco-spiritual or the psycho-spiritual dimension. And I think also that I don't necessarily think the people of China would be that averse to it, because there's a strong thread of restoring their traditional culture and connection to nature that they have developed through that Whiteheadian discourse that informs that movement for ecological civilization. So that was one of the things I started learning when we went to that conference back in Pomona a number of years ago now. Kallenbach believes that the psycho-spiritual and the eco-spiritual dimension is essential to catalyze that new way of being and that new culture that's necessary to get us through this ecological crisis. And even though Aurobindo didn't think in those exact terms, he also, he talked about the religion of humanity, and he saw that as being absolutely essential to the formation of a functional world state that would be tight enough to function, but would still respect the freedom of the individual, as well as all the various cultural traditions that we have. This political economic thread, I also became aware of. I think it's a really strong thread in the ecological civilization movement. I remember there's one of these guys, I can't remember his name, but he was there in the after gathering of that World Ecology Research Network conference that we had at campus, and he was one of a group of people that, were kind of circled around Kim Stanley Robinson and talking, and, yeah, I tried to talk to him about some of the stuff we do at CIS, and he was like, "You guys think it's the end of days?" And I'm like, no, just an end time. Calm down, bro. And so, there's still going to be that tension. There's still going to be those people that just don't look at it in that way. And we need that political economy. We need that green economy, or else it's not going to work. But I think that it also wouldn't work really without the other eco-spiritual dimension. If we're having to pull ourselves up by the bootstraps out of some form of, severe environmental collapse. And, keep in mind, as I think you probably know, that this dissertation was really born out of a belief that that was inevitable, and was just my attempt to contribute something in that direction of rebuilding, or, as one of our old teachers used to say, how else could it work? What else is possible? And, honestly, like you may disagree with me a little bit, but I no longer feel as certain that environmental and socioeconomic collapse is certain, not only because of some of the advances and gains that we've made, which one of which just got rolled back yesterday, apparently, but because of other things that I've read about free energy technology and zero-point energy and its potential to solve the energy crisis and whatnot. And yes, I know I've thrown some weird stuff at you that relates to that, Sean, but I also have a friend from high school who went on to become a bona fide physicist and has been doing research in zero-point energy for the last 20 years. And I remember about 5 years ago, he said something about alien technology on Facebook or Instagram. And I thought, oh, wow, that's really brave of you to say, But then as I started doing the research, I kind of realized that it's been kind of an open secret for going on 70 years now, let's say. So it's time, and I have a lot of hope in that direction that would solve a lot of our problems. But, as you have been fond of telling me, it would be great if the ETs would come save us, but we can't wait around for them.
Yes. Yeah. As you know, despite my avid interest in sci-fi and the alien theme, I've decided to bracket that because I think, time is sort of run out. It would have to be a miraculous intervention at this point. I have so many other questions I could ask, but I want to give the other committee members a chance. So do either Dr. Schindler or Dr. Chalquist, either of you have a burning one? I mean, maybe I'll give it to should I give it to our guest first, Craig Chalquist? Okay, Dr. Schindler, please, if you have something ready to go, please do.
Okay.
Great, we can hear you.
He's muted.
Right. He hit the mute button.
Craig, you're on mute.
We had a whole thing with the mute button at Megan's defense. There we go.
How's that? Okay.
Got you.
Oh,
Good.
That's good.
All right. So you had a quote from Starhawk. How do we build a new world when people are so damaged by the old? And then you had a phrase that actually evoked a response from your small crowd that's giving you support here, which I love this phrase, the democratization of enlightenment. And this goes to the tension between the political and the spiritual, psychological, or eco-psychological that Sean was referring to. Mm-hmm. What's your understanding of the democratization of enlightenment? And also a third part of this is, how did Sri Aurobindo then envision the unfolding of, or the adoption of, or the creation of the religion of humanity? In other words, how does this leap happen, the so-called democratization of enlightenment, as you see it, Indigo?
Yeah, that's a great question. Thank you, Craig. Well, first off, this democratization of enlightenment is what really got my motor going with the 2150 book. And that's where I started to see those connections and want to bring that book into conversation with Aurobindo. And then as I was reading Ideal of Human Unity, all the little light bulbs kept going off. And, I just kept getting really excited about these connections and what seemed to be this science fiction depiction or imagination of what he had been talking about. It was like 100 years earlier or 70 years earlier at that point. I didn't talk about this much in the defense, but Aurobindo I did have a quote in there where he was talking about the religion of humanity becoming the law of inner life. And he said a few different things about that. And he actually mentions philosophical anarchism almost a dozen times in that book, because he is very much going back to the original spiritual and philosophical roots of anarchism, which was never a violent overthrow or even absence of government. That was brought in by Mikhail Bakhtin. The original philosophical idea was very much in alignment with conscious evolution and the idea of humanity eventually evolving to a place where we become so conscious of our inner spirit that we're able to be a self-governing, self-regulating organism in community with other self-governing, self-regulating organisms. And, the macro philosophy, that book goes on and on about, oh, well, we don't have any laws. Well, why doesn't anyone kill each other? Oh, well, we just believe it isn't possible because, we're so spiritually evolved. And, it sounds like pie in the sky, but, they make a pretty strong case for it that probably derives mostly from New Thought there. Yeah, I think that Aurobindo is a little bit deliberately vague, but that he also saw, I think he didn't want to toot his own horn, but I think he knew he was making a contribution in that direction with integral yoga. And I think he offered our integral yoga as one possible path to that realization of that inner spirit, that inner law, because it involves the yoga of ascent and the yoga of descent, the involution and evolution, the raising of the spiritual consciousness, and also drawing down the heavenly supramental realms into the earthly plane. And that's part of what I think to be the process of how the entire third dimension gets to ascend, because each of the 12 dimensions ascends kind of in accordance, according to this personal belief that I've developed. I have this image of like these 12 super singularities that are orbiting around each other, these 12 super consciousnesses at the highest dimension, and then they choose to merge and then fragment back down, and they create a new first dimensional reality, right, as my water bottle falls. And that it's like this in-breath and out-breath of the universe is how I've heard it described. But this idea that the whole third dimension will pretty much will ascend into a higher plane and kind of take everyone with it. And then, whatever souls choose to stay behind and continue that journey will be able to do that as well in the third dimension. So, yeah, so that's kind of how I look at it. And then Megan just reminded me to mention the global brain theory, which I didn't bring in, but that, Tristan Gulliford mentioned it via Howard Bloom, but Barbara Marx Hubbard actually got it from Peter Russell. And that was the idea in contrast to the global depopulation and the 300 million members of the macro family that are left in 2150. His idea was that we actually need more population growth, that we need to get to about 10 billion people, where each individual human being is like a neuron in the brain, which has about 10 billion neurons, and that would initiate some kind of global coherence and new form of collective consciousness.
Thank you, Indigo. I mean, just a comment, which is, in Noah Harari's Sapiens, he envisions or argues that it's almost inevitable that we're headed in the direction of becoming cyborgs, in the sense of a kind of a hybrid human techno based entity, robotic entity that no longer has individual awareness, has collective consciousness. So in that sense, it's the Borg. We're the hive. Okay. And I think what you're getting at is a profound tension that I also agree with, which is that if we were to lose the individual evolution of the soul, because see, I would see conscious evolution as something that's actually part of the perennial philosophy. Goes way back, way before wonderful Barbara Marx Hubbard, back to the great transformation, the actual age, that the individual soul has the capacity to evolve across time in many different traditions, right? So the tension here is for enough of us to evolve to that state so that we don't end up becoming part of a kind of technological totalitarianism like the Matrix.
Yes.
For example.
Yes, absolutely.
Right.
And this is one of the reasons that I wrote this dissertation. I want to make transhumanism obsolete. I think cities and powers make transhumanism obsolete. If I can clairvoyantly access the Akashic record, I don't need a microchip in my head that connects me to the internet. If I can telepathically communicate across any distance, then I don't need a microchip in my head that acts as my cell phone. Or a microchip in my finger that is called my soul, which is how I spend money, which from Cloud Atlas, which is being developed right now. That's actually happening. I can show you an article about it.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I got it. Good.
That was definitely one of my impetuses for doing this dissertation in the first place.
Yeah.
I've got a big problem with transhumanism, and I think that it has some things to offer in terms of extension of life and medical benefits. But I also, once again, we can get there through those clairvoyant healing powers that are demonstrated in 2150 and are spoken of in a number of spiritual traditions, including a number of Hindu traditions. So real quick note about the Borg and that Borgification, that fear of transhumanism, of that being the ultimate goal. Okay, so everybody, spoiler alert for the current season of Star Trek Picard. Okay, plug your ears. Okay, Sean, plug your ears. All right. They're doing something new where no, seriously, plug your ears, Sean. Go leave the room for 30 seconds. I'm not kidding. turn your speaker, turn your volume all the way down. Thumbs up. Give me a thumbs up. Okay. They're doing a thing with the Borg where the Borg are actually moving in a direction of a more individualized consciousness. Somebody basically makes the case to the Borg queen of, hey, I'm lonely. I think this is all coming from a place of your loneliness as well. So why don't we join forces? You've already assimilated me. So why don't we join forces and let's go back and make the collective into a more individualized place that respects freedom of thought, but also can take advantage of these, this cybernetic integration, but in a conscious way. So that's it. Okay. Sean, we're good. Okay.
Good. Just, I guess my one comment, Indigo, is that at the core of everything you're doing, hold on to that tension between the evolution of the individual toward a more enlightened awareness and the evolution of our society towards justice and sustainability, so that you don't let go in either direction. Keep the tension. It's built into everything you're trying to bring together, but that kind of tension is incredibly creative to hold that instead of dropping into one side or the other. Okay.
You got it, brother.
Great, thank you for that. We'll have time, I hope, for a second round. But Dr. Chalquist, would you like to engage our candidate?
Yeah, thanks so much. And thank you, Indigo, for your work. As you know, it took me a while to catch up to it, and I still am in some ways. So I'm glad I'm finally part of it. I'm only going to ask one question because I actually have to go at 1. So my time is limited. But the question I wanted to ask you is, as you know, in the past, what we're thinking of as the evolutionary impulse, if I could put it that way, that arises from collective consciousness, but also sources deeper than that, has taken the form of sacred texts, clergy, religions, doctrines, things like that. So what I wanted to ask you based on your work is, why is it now showing up as science fiction?
That's a great question, Craig. Alexei and Corey Panshin get into that pretty deeply, but I really was only able to just scratch the surface of that book, really just to pull the reference, because I knew that I wanted to go in that direction, and I felt good to have that affirmation that I wasn't crazy. I think we both agree that science fiction is emerging as our new modern mythology, and I think it's always been, or at least for the last 130 years or so, since Edward Bellamy wrote News from No, that was William Morris wrote News from Nowhere, but Edward Bellamy, Looking Backward. Edward Bellamy wrote Looking Backward, as a vehicle for utopian socialist ideas, and he anticipated a lot of very interesting things like debit cards and food kitchens, and I think you know what it is? It's that freedom of imagination that you talk about in your Declaration of Enchantment. Science fiction offers this unfettered freedom of imagination. You can go anywhere with it. You can do anything with it. And people have done all kinds of crazy stuff with science fiction. There was so much that I could have included, so many other books that I could have included, and maybe dropped Ecotopia emerging or just mentioned it briefly or something. But I had a bit of tunnel vision, but I was always aware of this wider thread, this science fiction community in which I'm embedded. And, I've been a diehard Star Trek fan since I was 5 years old, man. My mom loved it because she knew that every Wednesday night at 8 p.m. in our market here in the Bay Area, she could she could sit me in front of the TV and she could have an hour to herself. And I would even not bother my sister for that hour. I was just so into it. And I've read other cool things that indicate that Star Trek has deliberately been planted in our timeline to help magnetize us towards that future, that positive future. And I believe that, but that's just because that's one of the things that gives me hope and helps me sleep at night. Nice. So maybe that's it too, the hope.
Yeah. I'm thinking too of the sense of wonder.
Yeah.
When we deliteralize a little bit and let the imagination go, then we get re-enchanted.
Yeah.
Yeah. I remember spending hours in church when I was growing up, and I was so bored. And there was no attempt to reach my imagination or anybody else's. It was all rote. It was all, this is what you have to think.
Going through the motions, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I just want to presence, you've reminded me to include the yoga of descent and the process of descension. And, science fiction gives us a great vehicle for the shadow too. I'm personally not into horror movies because I don't like to fill my brain with that kind of content, but it's definitely shadow content, and whoever's making those movies is working through some shit. And but other dystopian, go all the way back to 1984 and Brave New World and all that. It gives us a vehicle to ponder the worst possible possibilities so that we maybe don't go there.
Yeah. I'm glad you mentioned that book and some of the others. I met Stanley Robinson at a conference in Hong Kong where we were both presenting, and I got to have dinner with him. And he said 1984, The Handmaid's Tale, a bunch of others. The authors don't like to call them science fiction, but they are, So.
Well, Kallenbach didn't like to be called science fiction either, but he was.
Yeah. Yep. Yeah. Good. Well, thank you so much.
Thank you. That was a great one. Thank you.
Well, Dr. Chalquist, if when you do leave, if you leave before us, I'm I'm hoping you can maybe email me
Sure.
your bullet point conclusions so that Dr. Schindler and I can use that to come to a decision.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. Yeah, I'll make sure you know that before I go.
Or maybe you can just put it in the chat directly to me. Make sure it's not everyone.
Yeah, I will.
Okay. If I may, Indigo, I love that quote by Françoise. I think it's Françoise, by the way, not Francois. Françoise d'Aubonne. Capitalism is the last stage of patriarchy. Oh, that's so rings so true to me. Now, if that's true, then not only patriarchy but capitalism. No, let me reframe it. It's my view. It's not only my view. I'm one among many who believe that capitalism is the main driver of the extinction of complex life on the planet. We could call it industrial growth society, but it's also capitalism, greed for gain, and it is admittedly as well generally a capitalism that is run by and for men. I think that's needs to be said. But if all of this is true, and given how dire things are right now, which is reflected actually in the leading edge, as you know, of science fiction, which is not of the Star Trek variety or 2150. It's almost all dystopian, or most of it. I mean, there's cyberpunk, of course, solar punk. Yeah. But the center of gravity is definitely shifting in the direction of the dystopian, apocalyptic, and I think for good reasons. If we just look at the state of the world right now. So assuming there is some hope or realistic possibility of averting the worst, wouldn't it seem that that would have to involve not only, if not the death, the radical challenge to capitalism, but also to the rampant American dream-led individualism, the kind of hyper-individualism that that is reflected not only by U.S. imperialism, but by the dominant culture, at least in this country, where people are so alienated, atomized, cut off from each other, preoccupied with their own individual lives. And if that's true, then can you imagine that it might, in order to even have a chance at averting the worst, might it not be the case that some kind of even strategic preferring of a collectivist worldview and strategy in terms of the political economy might be the way to go to avoid the worst? This is related to Dr. Schindler's injunction, which I personally agree with, of the necessity for creative dialogue between psycho-spiritual and the political, economical, but also the individual and the collective. But just given the extremity of our situation right now.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm not denying that, and I think that's really what Robinson tried to show in his book was the triumph of that eco-political economy. And he has this whole thing about the graduating class, the 2012 graduating class of Harvard Law School making a secret pact to go out and change the world for the better and all that. But then, that's just his narrative device. I just don't think, I'm not sure how we can get there right now. I don't think that the democratic establishment has much use for any kind of collectivism or even any kind of much more than environmental lip service. I mean, they're trying, but they just don't get much done. And then the other side, is pro carbon output, wants to completely deny climate change, thinks it's all a bunch of hooey. I'm still working out how we can bring those two sides together into some form of cohesive action plan. I don't think that I don't think it's going to be that easy. You know, for a long time, I felt like basically everything was going to have to fall apart before anything would get better, because that would be the only thing that would shake people up enough to be willing to change. But yeah, I mean, like I said earlier, short of us getting some functional fusion or 0-point energy technology that works, we need to start reducing carbon outputs, and it's still going to take 100 years to see any kind of measurable impact on average global temperatures because of the carbon half-life. So we of course, we need to keep pursuing all possible options. And I tend to think that trying to advance this form of eco-spiritual consciousness might help get more people on board. I mean, if we could get Congress as fired up about this issue as they are about some other things, we could maybe see some traction. But you know, I just personally see more gridlock and infighting than ever before right now, in that sense. Yes, but I'm still not sure quite how we're going to get from here to there.
Great. Dr. Schindler, do you have anything else you would like to ask Indigo, or any comments?
Indigo, I have a comment that relates to the last thing you said about hope.
Yeah.
Václav Havel, the Czech playwright, leading dissident against the Soviet Union, after his plays were shown in Czechoslovakia under Soviet domination, people would come backstage and practice to learn how to be more collective and how to create a functioning democracy. He was arrested and thrown into a Soviet-run prison in Czechoslovakia, from which in 1985 he wrote the pamphlet, The Power of the Powerless. And in that pamphlet, he said, hope is a dimension of the soul, an orientation of the spirit that is not dependent upon the external circumstances that we are facing, unquote. The pamphlet, of course, spread around Eastern Europe, became one of the inspiring and organizing documents for the Velvet Revolution. 4 years later, millions of people stood up and tore down the Berlin Wall and the Iron Curtain. He was elected the first president of Czechoslovakia. He, of course, had no way of knowing that that would happen, could happen. And I guess I come back to some kind of core faith that, you know, if you knew, Indigo, what the way through was, if you actually knew that you knew, almost certainly that would not be it. That, you know, that's where we get into dogma. And really, it's the spirit of open inquiry, as Einstein said, that is essential to our advancement. And we love, you know, in science fiction and in all fiction, we love the dramas that are just in the nick of time.
Mm-hmm.
We love the dramas where we don't know the answer, we don't know how the metamorphosis is going to take place, but then it does. And you know, I just try, as you know, you've known me for many years, to maintain the faith that in my life, the stance of the hope in the way that Havel defines it. It's a dimension of the soul. And it then keeps us all going, you see. And we get that each one of us matters. So what Sean is doing matters, Craig's doing matters, what you're doing here to hold this, it all matters in ways that we cannot yet see the ripple effect by definition. And if we could, we would be bored.
Mm-hmm.
it wouldn't be the vast adventure of samsara that we're in. So I just tell you to, don't give up. Hopelessness, when we choose to be right about it being hopeless, it's the booby prize. I looked up what booby prize means. It's the award given in a competition to the least effective strategy.
That's good. Yeah, thank you, Craig. Yeah, that's your new title. Choose hope. You matter.
Exactly.
Yeah. I am an eternal optimist. That's part of what informed this whole utopian dissertation. I think that ultimately it's all going to be okay. I see that evolutionary trajectory towards higher levels of consciousness. Aurobindo, Hubbard, Garner. I did a little piece about the arc of the moral universe. I took it back to Theodore Parker that Dr. King paraphrased that from, and yeah, I think it bends towards justice and evolution. And so, yeah, I've been saying this for years. It's the end of the world as we know it, and I feel fine. But
that's great. I love that.
There's also there are things that can be done for sure. I shouldn't imply that, but it would be on the level of like, general strikes or things like Sunrise Movement and Extinction Rebellion have been doing, just to shake things up or honestly shut things down enough to the point to get certain things passed. But then it all just ends up getting bogged down in bureaucracy anyway, has been my observation. But even so, I still remain optimistic. The whole evolving past this convoluted bureaucracy and whatnot.
Good, buddy. Sean, I'm gonna run out of time here too.
Yeah. I was just about to say that I think we have come. We're actually past our scheduled time, and Dr. Chalquist has provided me a note, so we have his. He doesn't need to be here for this part, so I think at this point maybe Dr. Schindler and I will recuse ourselves. We'll go to a little breakout room and come to our decision. We'll be back in a couple of minutes. Do you have I hope you have just a couple of minutes, Dr. Schindler?
Oh, of course.
Okay, great. So Stefan, are you able to great, and great, thank you. And I think we should just be able to click a button to return to the main room afterwards. Okay.
All right.
Great. Here it is. So you have to click that join, Dr. Schindler, if you can there.
There we go.
Yeah. That was fun.
Thanks, everyone.
Who's the gray-haired woman?
She's
participating in anything.
That's Benita. She's from our Wisdom Council with Dr. Craig Schindler.
Oh,
Yeah.
Hello, everybody. This was just so amazing. I knew I had to be here.
Oh, thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, nice work, Indigo. Good work.
Thanks, Larry.
Yeah.
Hi, Larry.
hey there.
Yeah, congratulations, Indigo. That was great.
Thank you, Stephen. Anybody have any other questions or anything they want to bring up while we're waiting?
Hey, Ryan, I just wanted to point out that the very last entry in Anne Frank's diary reads, "I still believe in spite of everything that man is truly good at heart." And you just channeled her there at the end. And I got really, really teared up.
Wow.
So nicely done. Bravo.
Thank you.
Yeah, I have a question about you brought in the 5-MeO and everything at the end there, and so we're seeing ourselves now at this exact same moment with plants and synthetics, where we have this tug of war between going back to the earth and then this sort of synthetic pharmaceutical around these substances, these materials which can give us access to these higher conscious level states. How do you see that playing out in this sort of vision, in terms of, it seems like there's a pull to sort of grab this medicine that can be helpful for this, and what do you see sort of the dynamics play out in this sort of evolution of psychedelic medicine?
Yeah, that's great, man. Thank you for that. That's we've talked a lot about this, and that's a perfect question from you. I think again, it's a both and, we need to preserve the roots and also explore those other options, I think. But it's like, it's craft beer versus Anheuser-Busch. It's preserving craft small batch cannabis and small growers in the face of, these massive corporations that, I've worked for some. And in the case of 5-MeO DMT, I have to point out that it was a synthetic formulation that got me there that last time when I had the complete surrender, and I just lay there going, yes, okay, I'm ready, for about 20 minutes or so, but then I only became aware of it for like the last minute or two. That has some profound implications for organized psychedelic initiation and end of life therapy and all other kinds of cool stuff. But I stand with you, brother, on your struggles against what's been going on with the corporatization of ayahuasca and DMT and mushrooms and all that. And we have to hold that line and preserve that roots culture. The pharmaceutical advances are useful, but they can't come at the expense of that. Just like transhumanism can't come at the expense of the loss of our soul.
Yeah, right. Definitely. Yeah. Not so much in terms of the critique of the synthetic versus the natural, but that the synthetic naturally implies that probably some big pharmaceutical company is going to have to do it. Or they're even talking about putting up a chip in terms of your transhumanism.
Yeah, I've heard that. That sounds kind of
little
sus.
doses of stuff, So it's like we're also kind of we're on this sort of threading the needle between all these different ideas, between this sort of nature-based, community-based, grassroots-based, and this sort of hierarchical, top-down, structured, synthetic, not removed from nature approach. And so I think it was really interesting to see kind of how you wove that into your topic as well, and see how this plays out over time.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, brother. Anyone else? Stephen, you want to say anything? I really got a lot out of your work with Mira and the Philosophy Cosmique. And yeah, I got to send you this article by Alan Kaslev. It'll blow your mind. He republished it in 2020, but it looks like he made minimal changes. String theory hasn't changed much.
Yeah, I haven't. He pulled down his website for a while. I see that it's back up again, but I haven't dipped into it. I've been so busy with other things.
Yeah.
Nothing except that I was kind of honored that you brought me into your defense. That was kind of wonderful. And the mother is she's an interesting figure, because even within the community, she doesn't occupy a central place. It's almost, and yet Sri Aurobindo's whole, he said that it's about her. It's really about surrendering to this force, the divine conscious force.
Yeah.
And her embodiment was incredibly dynamic. Anyway, I see they're back.
And they had a divine union thing going on. They don't talk much about it, but they totally did.
Absolutely.
We're all
right.
vibrating from
Thanks, guys.
Really?
I got a couple of jumping up and down. Yeah, my reading ones got longer.
Yeah. Sean, you're on mute still.
How are you feeling now, Indigo?
Feeling great.
I think you're still sharing screen, Indigo, because I still see thank you questions.
Oh, I can stop that. There we go.
There, great. Okay. Here we are. So Dr. Chalquist, as you know, had to go, but he communicated to me his assessment, and Dr. Schindler and I conferred. So of the three possibilities, first of all, we about the dissertation, we found that the defense today has not revealed anything else that we about the dissertation. So we are happy with it as it is, with the understanding that there are just little things, house cleaning to do with it, but no substantial revisions. It's a very impressive dissertation. actually, as Dr. Schindler said, there's probably 3 different dissertations in there. So one of the challenges will be
There is.
to extract them, especially if you're thinking of publication. You'll probably have the possibility of at least a couple of books or many articles from there. And we as for the defense, we thought that you handled yourself very well. You demonstrated your command of the body of literature that you presented and the areas of concern that it touches upon in response to our questions. So the conclusion therefore is that we are delighted to welcome you into the community of doctors, Dr.
Thank you so much.
Yeah. And yes. The other Craig said, please congratulate you and may the 4th be with you.
Bravo.
Oh, that's great.
Yeah, congratulations,
Thank you so much.
Indigo.
Thank you.
Oh, it's been a long time coming, but you
Long time indeed.
certainly deserve it.
Thank you. I think our friend Blair took about 14 years, so I'm in good company.
Yeah.
Dr. Carter.
Yeah. Were you a late baby, by the way?
Dad, was I? Nancy? Sorry, Nancy. You would know better than I think.
He's been late for almost.
No, no, he was actually exactly on time.
Okay.
You were born on your due date, which is very unusual.
Well, Nancy has her favorite quote from Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, Douglas Adams, about, I love deadlines. I love the whooshing sound as they make when they go whooshing by.
Exactly. I'm sorry, sweetheart. That's genetic.
Yeah, it's okay. I forgive you.
Oh, wow. So how does it feel?
Feels good. I feel relieved.
I know, theoretically, it could have gone either way.
Yeah, I feel like after September when thank you. After September when it's published, I want to go down the rabbit hole with you.
Oh yeah. Haven't we been there already?
Oh, we've been there, but I need you to read that Kennedy book that I gave you.
Oh, well, I did leaf through it, and I watched it, and as you know, I watched a good portion of.
Oh, I didn't. I thought you stopped 15 minutes into the video.
It was more. No, it was halfway through. It was.
Oh, okay.
It was with his enthusiastic endorsement of Trump that I thought, okay,
I know.
I just couldn't find.
I know. It's hard. That's one of the challenges there.
Yeah. But yeah, many rabbit holes to explore, thankfully.
Yes. Looking forward to fully becoming your colleague and friend.
Well, you were always my friend, and it's a delight.
Thank you, Ambassador Spock.
Yeah, it's a delight to formally welcome you as a colleague too.
Thank you. No, seriously, I hear this from Nancy all the time as well. Like, I am and have always been your friend, Jim. But no, you really are my Mr. Spock, and the 2 Craigs are like my rocks of Gibraltar. That's how I've been thinking of it this last couple of months. Yeah.
That's sweet.
Yeah.
Oh, well, I wish, in the old days we would have met in person, and not in person, in the flesh world, not the digital world.
Yeah.
And we could go out for a meal together. I wish we could do that, a meal and a celebratory drink.
Let's you and I get together soon.
Yes, we'll do that.
Yeah, I have some feels about that too. I was actually on a mission originally with the other defenses I'd attended to get all 3 of you in the room at the same time. I'd never actually seen that happen. But I'm in my living room on my computer with my family and friends here. I'm flanked by my bookshelf and our ancestor altar. It worked out.
Good. Yes, I'm grateful for it. This is, yeah. Well, all right. I think.
All right. Craig signing off.
Yeah,
Craig.
Congratulations.
Congratulations. A big hug to you, Indigo. And let's be in touch soon. Okay.
Okay. Sounds good. Thank you,
Okay,
Sean.
congratulations, Dr. Moonstar.